The Letter by the Sea. Chapter 1. The Letter by the Sea. Section 1. The Harbor. The morning came heavy with mist. The sea was quiet, but not still. The tide breathed in slow, tired waves that pushed against the rocks and slipped back again. The gulls cried over the water like things that had lost their way. Elena walked along the pier with her hands in her coat pockets. The boards were slick, and the smell of fish and rust rose from the water. She liked mornings like this, when the world moved slowly, as if it were remembering something it didn't want to forget. A man was crouched by one of the boats, working on a tangled net. He wore an old blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. His hair was the color of sand that had been left too long in the sun. He looked up when she passed, and his eyes caught hers in a way that felt both casual and deliberate. "Got a cigarette?" he asked. She stopped. "I don't smoke." He smiled a little. "Then I'll take one of yours anyway." She hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out the pack she carried for other people. She didn't know why she still did that. Maybe habit, maybe hope. She handed him one and watched as he lit it, the flame small and quick in the gray air. He drew in the smoke and looked toward the sea. "They say the storm's moving north," he said. "Then it's late," she replied. He nodded. The sound of the wind shifted. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The boats rocked and the ropes creaked softly against their cleats. "Your boat?" she asked. "Was," he said. "Now it's mostly memory." She looked at him more closely. His voice was rough, but not unkind. There was something familiar about it, something from another season. She wanted to ask where he was from, but the question felt too personal for a morning like this. He flicked the cigarette into the water. "You live near here?" "I used to." He nodded again, as if that explained everything. "Funny thing about used to," he said. "It's never as far away as you think." She almost smiled. "No, it isn't." A gull dove close to the pier, skimming the water. The man watched it, then picked up the net again. His hands were steady, practiced. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "You waiting for someone?" "No," she said. "Not anymore." He tied a knot and pulled it tight. The sound of it was sharp in the quiet. "Good," he said. "That makes two of us." She looked out over the water. The mist had begun to thin, showing the faint outline of the far shore. The air smelled of salt and metal and something faintly sweet, like old wood. He stood, stretching his back, and wiped his hands on his shirt. "You walk this pier often?" "Sometimes," she said. "Then maybe I'll see you again." "Maybe," she said. He smiled, a tired, knowing smile, and turned back to his boat. She watched him a moment longer, then walked on. The sound of her steps faded against the wood until all that was left was the slow pulse of the tide. He smiled, a tired, knowing smile, and turned back to his boat. She watched him a moment longer, then walked on. The sound of her steps faded against the wood until all that was left was the slow pulse of the tide. She didn't look back. She told herself there was no reason to, though she could feel the weight of his gaze behind her. Or maybe it was only the pull of memory, that small and treacherous gravity. The mist had lifted enough for the sun to show its dull face through the clouds. It made the water shine in a way that looked almost kind. She stopped at the end of the pier and looked down. The reflection of her coat moved like smoke on the surface, wavering, uncertain. She thought of the letter waiting on her kitchen table. She had set it there 2 days ago and walked around it since, as if it were something alive that might bite. She didn't know why she hadn't thrown it away. Maybe because throwing it away would make it real. A gull screamed overhead, and the sound startled her. She drew her coat tighter and turned back toward the town. The air had that faint metallic taste that comes before rain. As she walked, she could still smell the smoke from the cigarette she hadn't smoked. It clung to her fingers, thin and sharp, like a reminder of something unfinished. The road from the harbor climbed gently toward the town. It wound past the bait shop, the shuttered cafe, and the narrow row of houses that leaned together like old men whispering in the wind. The windows were fogged, the paint peeling in thin white curls. She walked slowly, her shoes dark with moisture from the pier. A truck passed, leaving the faint smell of diesel and brine. She lifted her hand in a small wave to the driver, though she didn't know him. People here always waved. It was the kind of place that mistook recognition for understanding. At the top of the hill, she stopped and looked back. The sea was a pale sheet of pewter now, the boats like black punctuation marks against it. She thought of the man again, the way his voice had carried, low and rough, as if it had been shaped by weather. It had the sound of someone who had left too many places behind. Her house stood just beyond the bend, small and square, with a garden that hadn't grown much since spring. The curtains were drawn, and she liked it that way. From here, she could almost see the table inside and the single envelope waiting on it. She started walking again, slower now, as if every step took her closer to something she wasn't sure she wanted to reach. Would you like me to continue straight into section 2? The letter introduced. Picking up at the moment, she enters the house and confronts that waiting envelope. Section 2. The letter introduced. The house was cool when she entered. She closed the door softly, as if there were someone sleeping in another room. The air smelled faintly of salt and old wood, the way all houses near the water do. She set her coat on the back of a chair and stood for a moment, listening. The only sound was the ticking of the clock above the stove, steady, patient, unbothered by anything human. The letter lay where she had left it. A single white envelope on the kitchen table, curled slightly at the edges from the damp. It caught the light from the window, the paper breathing faintly in the draft. She looked at it without moving closer. It had no right to be there. The handwriting was his, that neat, slanting script she had known by touch more than sight. Even now, it felt like he had written it in the next room. She filled the kettle and set it on the stove. The sound of the flame breaking through the metal filled the silence. She reached for a cup and found it wasn't clean. She washed it slowly, though there was no need to. Her hands worked out of habit, not purpose. When the kettle began to hum, she poured the water into the cup and sat at the table. The letter waited between her elbows. Steam rose in soft, uncertain curls, and she watched it instead of the paper. She remembered the way he had looked that morning. The blue shirt, the easy voice, the eyes that always seemed to be carrying something unsaid. Maybe that was what she had always loved in him, the unfinishedness of it all. She took a sip of the tea and grimaced. It was too hot, too bitter. She set it down. The clock ticked again. Outside, a gull screamed once, and the sound came thin through the glass. She reached out and touched the corner of the envelope. The paper was cool and smooth. She traced the letters of her name, small and deliberate. It was strange to see her name in his hand again, as if the years between them had been a rumor. She leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes. Dialogue, soft and almost to herself. "You couldn't have waited," she said quietly. "You never could." The words surprised her. They came out thin, almost tender. She opened her eyes again. The light had changed. The room was darker now, the color of pewter. The envelope seemed to hold its own faint glow, like something alive in the grayness. She stood and walked to the sink. Her reflection in the window looked older than she felt, though she wasn't sure she still felt much at all. She wiped her hands on a towel and turned back to the table. The letter was still there. It would always be there, whether she opened it or not. Some things don't need to be read to be understood. She blew out a small breath and smiled without meaning to. It was a tired smile, one that belonged to someone who had already chosen their pain. The clock ticked on. She stood a while longer, watching the light shift along the table. A wind moved through the open window, slow and cool. It lifted the edge of the envelope and let it fall again, a small, soft sound, like a sigh. She looked at it once more, then turned away. The kettle, long forgotten, clicked as it cooled. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping the glass in an unhurried rhythm. She didn't move to close the window. She let the sound come in. That night, she dreamed of the sea again. Not the gray, tired sea of now, but the bright one from before, the one that smelled of sun and salt and unbroken hours. Dreams have no mercy. They open what you've tried to close. When she woke, the sound of rain was still there, but for a moment she couldn't tell if it was falling on the roof or the waves. Section 3. The first time. The summer she met him for the first time was all heat and salt. The air shimmered above the sand, and everything smelled of rope, tar, and citrus from the stalls near the docks. The sea was the color of glass bottles left too long in the sun. Elena was 27 then, not yet married, still living in the upstairs room of her father's house. The days were simple. Mornings at the bookshop, afternoons walking by the water, evenings that seemed to last forever. She remembered the hum of cicadas, the sound of the tide against the breakwater, and how she never thought much about leaving. He had come to the town with a charter boat and a promise of work. Daniel. The name had sounded larger than the place. as if it belonged to another country. He was lean, sunburned, his arms marked by rope and salt. People said he had been to places where the water turned green with fire at night. She didn't believe that, but she liked the sound of it. She first saw him at the market. He was buying lemons, holding one to his nose before dropping it into a brown paper bag. There was something deliberate about the way he moved, as if he had already decided what each moment should cost. He caught her looking. "You planning to buy one?" he said. "Or just making sure they're round?" She laughed. "Maybe both." "Fair enough." He paid for the lemons and nodded toward the stalls. "You live here?" "All my life." "Then you're lucky," he said. "You still have the option of leaving." She thought that was a strange thing to say. "And you?" "I already used mine." That evening, she walked down to the pier and found him again, tying lines to a new post. The boat was small but clean, its name painted in faded letters along the bow, Maribel. He looked up when she stopped beside him. "You're following me," he said. "I live here. You came to me." He grinned. "That's one way to see it." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the waves slap against the hull. Then he said, "Ever been out past the point?" "No." "Then come tomorrow. I'll show you what the water looks like when it has no memory." She almost said no. She had work, things to do, reasons not to go. But his voice had that quiet assurance that made refusal sound like a mistake. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow." The next day was clear and windless. The sea lay flat as glass, and the horizon was a thin blue line drawn by a careful hand. She met him at dawn. He had coffee in a tin cup and a rope in his hands. "Step aboard," he said. She hesitated only once, then took his hand. The wood was warm beneath her shoes, and the smell of diesel mixed with salt. He started the engine, and the boat moved forward with a low, contented hum. The town began to shrink behind them. The roofs, the church tower, the thin thread of smoke from a chimney. She looked back until she couldn't anymore. "Feels like flying," she said. "That's what it is," he answered. "Until you need to land." They rode past the point where the water darkened and the air turned cooler. He cut the engine and let the boat drift. The silence was wide and complete. He handed her a piece of bread and a small knife. "Breakfast," he said. She laughed. "This is breakfast?" "It's the sea," he said. "Everything tastes better when you've earned it." They ate, and the boat rocked beneath them. The sun climbed, and the light on the water turned white and hard. Later, when the wind rose, he showed her how to hold the line, how to lean with the pull. She wasn't strong enough, but she learned the rhythm. He stood behind her, guiding her hands. His breath was warm against her neck. "Don't fight it," he said softly. "Just listen." She didn't know if he meant the wind or something else. When they returned to the harbor, the afternoon had already begun to fade. She stepped off the boat and found her legs unsteady. He smiled. "You get used to it," he said. "I'm not sure I want to." He shrugged. "That's how you know you're still alive." She started to walk away, but he called after her. "Tomorrow." She turned. "Maybe." He laughed, not pressing. "Maybe's a good start." That night, she couldn't sleep. The sound of the tide reached her window, and in it she could still hear his voice. Calm, certain, threaded with distance. She thought about how he had said when the water has no memory. She didn't understand it then. Now, years later, she did. The sea remembers everything. Section 4, The Arrival. Morning broke unevenly. The rain had stopped, but the world still smelled of it. The air was clean and sharp, the kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. Elena stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee. The boards were damp beneath her feet. Across the bay, the boats rocked gently, their masts thin as pencils against the pale sky. She thought of him, and then tried not to. A sound came from the path below, slow footsteps, deliberate. She turned her head and saw him climbing the hill, shoulders hunched against the wind. For a moment she thought she was dreaming again. But he kept coming, and the shape of him did not fade. He stopped at the gate. "Morning," he said. His voice was the same, maybe quieter. "Morning," she said. She didn't move. He rested a hand on the gatepost. "Didn't think you'd still be here." "Neither did I." He nodded, as if that made sense. The pause stretched. Somewhere a gull cried out, high and lonely. "You going to let me in?" he asked finally. She stepped aside. "If you're just here for coffee." "That's all I ever was." He smiled when he said it, but his eyes stayed serious. Inside, the house felt smaller with him in it. He looked around the room. The same table, the same clock, the the same letter lying open now beside the cup. He noticed it at once. "You read it," he said. "I did." "Then you know." "I know you still don't know how to say things plain," she said. He looked at her for a long time. "Maybe I was hoping you'd still know how to hear them." She turned away, busying herself with the kettle though it didn't need boiling. "You wrote about the storm," she said. "About leaving again." He shrugged. "There's a job up north. Fishing. Just the season. You always say that." "It's always true when I say it." She poured water into 2 cups. The sound was louder than it should have been. "You could stay," she said, without looking at him. "Could I? You've done harder things." He didn't answer. He was standing by the window now, staring at the harbor. The mist was lifting again, the same as the day before. He said quietly, "I thought about you every time the wind changed." "That's a lot of thinking." "Not enough." They sat at the table. The clock ticked, steady as a heartbeat. He reached for the cup, but didn't drink. "You kept the letter," he said. "I keep everything that hurts." He gave a small, sad laugh. "That explains a lot." "You still talk in riddles," she said. "You still understand them." The kettle clicked as it cooled. The silence after was thick, but not cruel. Finally, he said, "I didn't come for forgiveness." "Good," she said. "I don't have any left." He nodded once. "Then maybe I came to see what's left of us." She looked at him across the table. The years sat between them like a third person, familiar, patient, unwilling to leave. "What's left," she said, "is whatever you didn't take with you." He smiled, tiredly. "Then I left more than I thought." Outside, the wind began to rise again. The curtains moved, and the smell of the sea came in. He stood. "I'll walk down to the pier," he said. "Boat leaves at dusk." She stayed seated. "You always did like your goodbyes short. They're the only kind that work." He hesitated, then reached across the table and touched the edge of the letter. "Keep it," he said. "Maybe next time I'll learn how to write the rest." "There won't be a next time," she said. He looked at her, and she almost believed he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "There always is. You just don't see it coming." He left the cup untouched and walked to the door. When it closed behind him, the house felt full and empty at once. Elena sat for a while, listening to the sound of his steps fading down the hill. Then she took the letter and folded it again, more carefully this time. The wind rattled the windows. The tide was rising. She thought of the first time, the sun, the lemons, the white horizon, and of how some things return not to be repeated, but to remind you they still exist. She stood, opened the window wider, and let the salt air in. After he left, the silence came back differently. It wasn't empty now. It was full of what hadn't been said. The air seemed to carry his voice in it, like smoke that lingers long after the fire is gone. Elena sat at the table and let her hands rest flat on the wood. The grain was rough under her palms. She traced a line in it with her thumb and thought of all the mornings that had passed here, the way light used to fall in clean squares across the floor. Time, she thought, doesn't heal much. It just teaches you where to put the pain so it doesn't show. The clock ticked once, and then again. Outside, the tide drew closer. She could smell the sea, sharp and alive, and somewhere beyond it, a boat engine turning over, steady and low. She knew the sound. She closed her eyes, and for an instant, the years between them vanished. There was only the sound of water and a letter waiting for her hands. The room had cooled again. The sky outside had that color the sea takes just before dusk, a blue that can't decide whether it means to stay or leave. Elena sat very still. The envelope lay where he'd touched it, the crease of his thumb faint on the paper. She reached for it without thinking. Her hands no longer trembled. They only felt tired. The flap lifted easily, as if it had been waiting for this. Inside was a single sheet, folded twice. His writing leaned forward, hurried but careful. She smoothed the page on the table and began to read. "Elena, if this reaches you, I'll already be gone north. Don't think of it as leaving, only as the distance I never learned to measure. The sea keeps what it wants. I've just stopped arguing with it. I used to think we ended because of time. Maybe it was only the quiet. You were better at silence than I was. You could live inside it. I always had to fill it with noise, wind, work, other shores. I told myself it was freedom. Maybe it was just fear of being seen. There isn't anything here to ask for. No forgiveness. Only the small hope that you'll remember we were once kind to each other, even when we didn't know how. If the storm stays south, I'll be back by autumn. If not, I'll send word." The sea owes me that much. D. She read it once, then again. Each line felt smaller the second time, like a tide pulling itself back into the deep. She traced the final initial with her finger. It was not a promise, not even a goodbye. It was a pause, the kind that waits for someone else to speak. She folded the letter, careful not to tear the edge. The paper was thin and soft, already worn from his hands. She could smell him in it: salt, tobacco, the faint sweetness of diesel oil. She pressed it against her chest for a moment, not in affection, but in recognition. The kettle on the stove began to hum again. She hadn't lit it. The metal was only remembering the day's heat. She smiled at that, small and without joy. She walked to the window. The tide had come all the way in now, reaching the base of the pier. The water shone like glass under the fading light. A boat moved slowly across the mouth of the harbor, its wake folding outward, long and white. It could have been his. It didn't matter. They all looked the same from this distance. The wind lifted the curtains, carrying the smell of rain and rope. She stood there, holding the letter loosely at her side. For a moment, she thought of burning it, to make the words into smoke, to let them leave properly. But she knew she wouldn't. Some things aren't meant to vanish. They're meant to wait. She placed the letter back on the table, set a glass on top to keep it from moving, and turned off the light. The house went dim, except for the faint blue that came through the window. Outside, the waves broke softly against the pilings. Inside, the quiet held steady. And in that stillness, she heard something new. Not forgiveness, not regret. Just the low, steady sound of herself breathing. Section 6. The tide turns. Night came without ceremony. The sky folded itself over the town, and the last of the light slipped quietly behind the headland. The sea, now full and dark, moved in long breaths against the shore. Each wave sounded deliberate, like the turning of a page. Elena lit a lamp, but left it low. The small circle of light caught the edge of the letter, the glass that held it down, the uneven grain of the table beneath. Everything else was shadow. She liked it that way. It made the room honest. She walked to the window and leaned her forehead against the glass. The harbor lights shimmered across the water, small and uncertain. She could hear the distant knock of a halyard against a mast, that slow rhythm sailors trust more than clocks. She thought of Daniel out there somewhere, the curve of his shoulders against the wind, the rope burns on his palms, his quiet way of disappearing. She wondered if he had turned north yet, if the engine had caught, if the sea had already taken him back. Then she told herself to stop wondering. The tide reached its high mark, touching the bottom step of the pier. The water was black now, but not cold-looking. It had a kind of patience in it. She opened the window wider. The air moved through the house, carrying salt and the faint trace of smoke from some fire along the beach. On the table, the letter stirred slightly under the glass, the paper breathing with the wind. She watched it lift and settle again, as though it wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. "You've said enough," she whispered. Her voice surprised her. It sounded calm, almost kind. She turned away and began to tidy the room, the slow, habitual motions of someone reclaiming her own space. She washed the cup, wiped the counter, folded the dishcloth neatly. When she finished, she stood in the center of the kitchen and listened. The house seemed to exhale. Outside, the tide began to turn. The water drew back, inch by inch, leaving thin trails of foam along the sand. The sound changed, softer now, uncertain, like a conversation ending. She could feel it in her chest, that same slow retreat. Tomorrow, she thought, she would walk to the pier again. Not to wait, just to see what the sea had taken and what it had chosen to give back. She closed the window, blew out the lamp, and let the dark have its way. The clock ticked once more. Then the only sound was the quiet rhythm of the tide going out. Chapter 2, Section 1. The morning after. The light came in slow, thin, and gray. It crept along the floorboards and found her where she sat, still dressed, her head tipped back against the chair. Elena had not slept so much as drifted, her thoughts moving in and out like the tide beyond the window. When she opened her eyes, the lamp had burned out, and the house felt colder. She rose and crossed to the window. Outside, the harbor was quiet. The water was drawn far back now, the boats sitting crooked in the mud, their hulls pale against the dark sand. Mist hung over everything, the kind that makes the world look softer but not kinder. She filled the kettle, though she didn't remember emptying it the night before. The burner clicked twice before it caught, the flame blue and sharp. She watched the metal darken with heat, and for the first time in days, she felt something like peace. It was not comfort exactly, but a stillness that did not ask for anything. On the table, the letter waited where she had left it, pinned beneath the rim of a glass. The paper was slightly warped now, curled from the damp air. She reached for it, lifted it free, and unfolded it carefully. Her eyes traced the words she already knew by heart. There was something new in them this time, a calmness she had missed before, the tone of a man who had stopped running, even if only for a moment. She noticed his handwriting had steadied near the end, as though he had written that final line slowly, aware of the weight it would carry. She thought of the last time she saw him write anything, a list for the market, his pencil dull, the words half finished before he'd gone to sea again. The kettle began to hum. She didn't move to pour it. Instead, she let the sound fill the room. The rising steam blurred the edges of the window, softening the day. She pressed her palm against the paper. It was cold, smooth, almost fragile. How easily it could have been lost, dropped in the water, torn by the wind, never meant for her at all. But it had found its way here, as if the sea itself had carried it. She folded it once more, set it aside, and finally poured the coffee. It was too strong, bitter, but she didn't mind. The first sip was enough to steady her. Outside, the gulls were awake, circling low over the empty harbor. Their cries broke the quiet in short, sharp bursts. Somewhere down the hill, a door closed, followed by a man's voice calling to someone unseen. The day was beginning whether she wanted it to or not. She pulled on her coat and stepped to the door. The air smelled of iron and salt. The mist was already thinning, lifting in slow, ghost-like folds. She looked back once at the table, at the letter, the cup, the faint ring of light on the wood, and then she stepped outside. The road to the harbor waited, still damp from the night's rain. Each step sounded louder than it should have. But she walked anyway, her breath steady, her hands in her pockets, and the wind at her back. Chapter 2, Section 2. The Walk to Town. The road curved downhill, slick from the night rain. Puddles held the sky in small, broken pieces. Elena walked slowly, her boots leaving clean marks on the wet stones. The mist had thinned, but the air still held the taste of salt and cold metal. She passed the old bait shop first, the one that hadn't opened since spring. The wooden sign still swung above the door, squeaking in the breeze. A gull sat on the roofline, patient and unmoving, its feathers ruffled by the wind. She nodded to it as she went, a quiet greeting to something that would never answer. Further down, the narrow houses leaned together, their paint faded to the same weary shade of gray. Curtains stirred as she walked by. People here noticed movement the way others noticed silence. A few of them waved. She raised her hand in return, just enough to be polite. At the corner, she stopped by the post office. The door was open, the bell above it rusted dull. Inside, the smell of dust and old paper lingered. Miriam, the postmistress, looked up from her desk and smiled. A small, habitual thing. "Morning, Elena," she said. "You're out early." "Couldn't sleep," Elena answered. Her voice felt strange in her own mouth, rough from disuse. Miriam nodded. "Weather'll change soon. You can feel it." Elena hesitated. Her hand brushed against the counter. "Any mail for me?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Miriam flipped through a thin stack of envelopes. "Nothing today." She smiled again, softer this time. "Maybe tomorrow." "Maybe," Elena said, and thanked her. She stepped back into the street, the bell giving a tired ring behind her. The mist had begun to lift in sheets, revealing the water below. From here, she could see the masts in the harbor, the ropes hanging loose, the small flags damp and limp. Her breath left in small clouds that disappeared as quickly as they came. When she reached the pier, she stopped. The spot where Daniel's boat had been was empty now, only the dark imprint of its hull on the wet wood. The rope that had tied it still hung over the edge, frayed at the end, brushing the tide. She stared at it for a long time. The sound of the sea filled the space where memory wanted to speak. She could still see him there, leaning on the railing, his sleeves rolled up, the light on his face. He'd never looked back when he left. That had hurt her once, but now she understood. Some men can't look back without drowning. She knelt, ran her fingers along the wet plank. and felt the grain catch at her skin. It was smooth where the rope had worn it down, years of tide and salt polishing what people had built to last. A small boat moved in the distance, its motor steady and low. She followed it with her eyes until it blurred into the horizon. The sea looked endless again, as it always did after loss. Too wide, too calm, too sure of itself. She straightened and turned away. The town behind her looked smaller now, folded into the gray morning. She could hear a bell somewhere up the hill, the cafe opening for the day. Her stomach ached faintly, but not from hunger. She started walking toward the sound, one slow step at a time, the wind at her back again, carrying the smell of coffee and the faint sweetness of bread. Chapter 2, Section 3. The Leaving Flashback. The smell of fuel had always meant departure. That morning, it hung heavy in the air, sharp enough to taste. The sun was bright, too bright for the hour, the kind of light that made everything look honest, whether you wanted it to or not. Daniel stood by the boat, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his hands working the rope with quiet purpose. He didn't look at her at first. He never did when he was leaving. It was easier for him that way, to stay busy, to stay moving. She watched him from the edge of the pier. Her hair was tied back, but the wind had already begun to pull it loose. She held her hands in the pockets of her coat, not because she was cold, but because she didn't trust what they might do if left free. "How long?" she asked. Her voice came out smaller than she meant. He glanced up. "A week. Maybe 2. You said that last time. I came back, didn't I?" She almost smiled, but it didn't reach her. "Not the same." He paused, looked past her toward the horizon. The water was clear that day, calm, deceptively calm. "I don't know how to stay here, Elena," he said. "It feels like the walls close in when I do." "That's not the town," she said. "That's you." He set down the coil of rope. For a moment, he just stood there, the distance between them filled with the sound of the tide tapping against the hull. "You always think it's so simple," he said quietly. "You make it sound like I'm choosing this. Aren't you?" He looked down at the boards. "It's not that easy." She stepped closer, close enough to smell the salt on his skin, the faint trace of tobacco. "If you go this time," she said, "don't come back unless you mean to." That made him look at her. His eyes were the color of the sea before a storm, dark, uncertain. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For once, he had no words. He reached out, brushed her sleeve with his fingertips, not her hand, not her face, just the fabric, as if he needed to remember the shape of her. Then he turned, stepped onto the boat, and untied the line. The engine coughed, sputtered, caught. She stood still as the sound grew louder, then steadied into that low rhythm she would never forget. The boat eased away, its wake spreading across the calm water, widening the distance between them. He didn't look back. She did. When the boat became a dark speck against the horizon, she whispered something, though she couldn't remember later what it was, maybe his name, maybe just the sound of it. The tide was rising then, swallowing her reflection on the wet planks. She waited until it reached her boots before she turned and walked home. Chapter 2, Section 4. The Choice, Present, with Marta at the cafe. The bell above the cafe door gave a soft jangle as Elena stepped inside. The warmth met her like an old friend, the scent of bread, coffee, and something faintly sweet. The windows fogged at the corners, and the low hum of morning voices filled the small room. Marta stood behind the counter, her sleeves rolled up, a towel slung across one shoulder. She was wiping down the espresso machine, her hair coming loose from its knot. When she saw Elena, her face opened into a smile that carried a kind of relief. "Well, I'll be damned," Marta said. "The sea didn't keep you after all." "Not for lack of trying," Elena said. Marta laughed, that low, throaty sound that always seemed to belong to her more than her words did. "Coffee, please." Marta poured it without asking how she liked it. She always remembered. The cup was chipped at the rim, the saucer mismatched. It had been that way for years, and Elena found it comforting. She took a seat near the window. Outside, the fog had lifted enough to show the curve of the pier and the slow shift of the tide. It looked the same as yesterday, but it didn't feel the same. Marta came over, setting the cup in front of her. She sat down opposite, resting her elbows on the table. "You look like someone who's been awake too long," she said. "Maybe I have." Marta nodded slowly. "Elena." Her voice softened. "Was it him?" Elena didn't answer right away. She just sipped her coffee. It was strong, hot, bitter. After a moment, she said, "There was a letter." Marta leaned back, folded her arms. "After all this time?" "Yes. And he's gone north. Said he might come back by autumn, if the storms allow." Marta gave a short, dry laugh. "He always did make friends with the weather." Elena smiled faintly. "Maybe that's why he liked it better than people. Or maybe it didn't argue with him," Marta said. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the hiss of steam and the soft clatter of dishes. A couple at the far table spoke in low voices, the rhythm of their words gentle, familiar. It made Elena think of what living used to sound like, not the grand moments, but the quiet ones. Marta broke the silence. "My brother wrote last week," she said, "from the northern coast. He's running that old lighthouse in now." Elena looked up. "The one by the cliffs?" "That's the one. Says he needs help. Someone who can cook a little, keep the books, talk to guests when he's out on the water. It's quiet there. Too quiet for him alone." Elena turned her cup slowly in her hands. "Quiet sounds fine to me." "You'd hate it by the second month," Marta said with a grin. "You need the sea close, but not the same one every morning." "Maybe that's true." Marta studied her for a moment. "You're thinking about it." "I don't know what I'm thinking," Elena said. "Then that's a start." Elena smiled at that, the smallest real smile she'd felt in a long while. Marta stood, gathered the empty cups. "You always said you'd leave this town one day," she said. "Maybe the day's just late." When Marta walked away, Elena stayed where she was. The window had cleared now, and the light outside was changing, a paler blue, the color the sea takes when the wind shifts north. She thought of the letter again, the steady hand near the end. She thought of the compass she'd found in the drawer, small, tarnished, still pointing north. Maybe the sea was trying to tell her something. Maybe it always had. She finished her coffee, stood, and placed a few coins on the table. When she stepped outside, the wind hit her full in the face. It was colder now, sharper, carrying the scent of rain that hadn't yet arrived. She turned toward home, but her steps slowed at the corner. She looked once more at the harbor, the water glinting like steel. The thought came quietly, without drama. Perhaps it's time to go. Chapter 2, Section 5. The Discovery. The house was cool when she returned. A thin line of sunlight had slipped through the curtains, drawing a narrow stripe across the floor. The letter was still on the table, its edge curling slightly from the damp. She touched it as she passed, the way one might touch a shoulder in passing, a small acknowledgement. She set her coat on the chair, slipped off her boots, and began to tidy the kitchen. It was something to do with her hands, something that didn't ask for feeling. The plates went back into their places, the cloth folded neat and square. She opened the window to let the air in. The wind carried the scent of kelp and old rope. When she reached the cupboard, she found the drawer had stuck again. She tugged it once, twice, until it gave with a groan. Inside were the things that gather in a life. Keys without locks, bits of twine, the rusted hinge from a gate long gone. And there, beneath them, was the compass. It was small, its brass dulled by years of handling. The glass was scratched, the hinge stiff. But when she tilted it, the needle moved, slow at first, then sure, steady as breath. She turned it in her palm, the way she used to turn stones as a child. Daniel had carried it always, tucked in his coat pocket, though he'd once told her he never trusted it. "The sea knows better than a needle," he'd said. And yet he'd kept it, like a superstition he couldn't quite give up. She ran her thumb over the worn engraving on the back. His initials, faint but still visible. DRH. It looked strange now, like the name of someone she'd read about, not loved. Elena sat down and set the compass beside the letter. The two things looked wrong together, one so precise, the other full of everything he'd never learned to measure. Yet they belonged side by side, as if one had been waiting for the other to return. The wind outside grew stronger. It rattled the window, lifted the edges of the curtain. She watched the compass needle tremble, then settle, pointing north. The direction of storms. The direction he had gone. She thought of Marta's words at the cafe. Maybe the day's just late. Elena leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes. She could still see the line of the coast in her mind, the lighthouse she'd heard of, the cliffs that faced the open sea, a place where the wind never stopped. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel afraid of leaving. The thought didn't hurt. It only felt clean, like a window opened after too many seasons closed. She opened her eyes. The compass still pointed north. The letter lay beside it, unmoving. "Maybe," she said softly. "That's enough." The room was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the silence that holds you still, but the one that asks what comes next. Chapter 2, Section 6. The Wind Changes. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of tarnished silver. A thin wind came off the water, sharp enough to raise the hairs on her arms. Elena walked down to the pier with her coat buttoned high and her hands deep in her pockets. The boards beneath her feet were slick with salt, and the air smelled of rain that hadn't yet started. The harbor was nearly empty. Most of the boats had already gone out or been pulled ashore for repair. Only a few small ones remained, rocking gently against their ropes. The tide was rising, slow and deliberate, climbing toward its evening mark. She stopped halfway down the pier and turned to look back at the town. The roofs were close together, their chimneys sending up faint threads of smoke. Somewhere behind those windows, lamps were being lit, fires stoked, dinners prepared. Life, she thought, was going on as it always did, unaware of what it carried inside its own quiet hours. She took the compass from her pocket. It was cold against her skin. The needle trembled in the wind before finding north again, steady and sure. She tilted it toward the horizon, where the sky darkened into the line of the distant headland. That was where the lighthouse stood, Marta's brother's place. She could almost picture it, the tower rising pale against the rocks, its glass eye waiting for night. It was far, but not unreachable. A train could take her part of the way. The rest she could manage. A gust of wind caught her hair, pulling it loose. She let it go. She was tired of holding things together that wanted to move. Below her, the sea pressed against the pilings. The sound was low and even, like breathing. For a long time she only listened. She had missed this kind of listening, the kind that didn't ask for answers. The first drops of rain began to fall, soft and scattered. They left small dark circles on the wood around her boots. She slipped the compass back into her pocket, closed her eyes, and breathed in the salt. When she opened them again, the clouds had begun to shift. The wind was changing, no longer from the west, but from the north. It carried a colder scent, something clean and wild. The gulls turned with it, their wings cutting through the pale light. Elena smiled, not wide, not for anyone to see, but enough to feel it move through her. She knew what the wind meant. It meant the season was turning. It meant it was time. She walked to the very edge of the pier, leaned forward slightly, and looked out across the water. There was no sign of a boat now, no trace of him, only the long, gray reach of sea. But for the first time, she didn't see loss in it. She saw direction. The sea was still speaking, she murmured, her voice nearly lost to the wind. But now I'm ready to answer. She turned then and began to walk back toward the town, toward her small house, the letter on the table, the life she would soon be leaving. Behind her, the tide kept rising, patient and certain, as it always had been. Chapter 3, Section 1. The Leaving. The morning was pale and windless. The kind of morning when even the gulls stayed low and quiet. Elena arose before the town stirred, before the baker's light came on or the first cart passed the square. She dressed in the half-dark, the same wool coat, the boots she'd worn for years, a scarf that still smelled faintly of salt. The house felt smaller than it ever had. Every sound seemed amplified, the hinge of the wardrobe, the soft click of the latch. She moved slowly, folding her things into the small canvas bag. 2 shirts, a book, a few coins, the letter, and the compass wrapped in an old handkerchief. No more than she could carry with one hand. It was enough. When she looked around the room, she realized there was nothing else that truly belonged to her. Not the chair, not the clock that ticked unevenly in the corner, not even the photograph on the wall. Those were remnants of a life that had already turned its face away. She made tea and drank it standing by the window. Outside, the horizon was just beginning to show its edge, a thin strip of light between the sea and the sky. The tide was retreating, exposing dark sand and the ribs of boats pulled high onto the shore. She thought of Daniel's words once, long ago. Every tide leaves something behind. Maybe he'd been right. When the cup was empty, she set it in the sink and reached for the key. It was smooth from years of use, its metal worn thin where her thumb always rested. She stepped outside and locked the door. The sound of the bolt sliding home echoed too loudly in the still air. For a long moment, she stood on the step, her bag at her feet. The street was quiet, the houses still asleep. Only the smell of the sea moved, faint but insistent, like memory. She slipped the key under the mat, just as Marta would have done. She didn't leave a note. There was nothing that needed saying. The walk to the station took her through the edge of town, past the bakery, the post office, the narrow lane where the children used to play. Each place was both familiar and already distant, as if she were walking through a painting she'd loved once, but no longer needed to keep. When she reached the hill above the harbor, she turned for one last look. The sea lay open and gray, flat as hammered pewter. A few boats moved toward the horizon, their sails like thin white scars against the morning. She thought of the compass in her bag, its needle steady even when the world wasn't. The station was nothing more than a platform and a small wooden shelter. A dog slept beneath the bench. The telegraph wires hummed faintly overhead. Elena sat, her hands folded in her lap, and waited. When the train came, it came quietly, just a low rumble at first, then the sudden rush of wind. She stood, lifted her bag, and climbed aboard. The conductor nodded. She nodded back. No words passed between them. Through the window, the town slid away, the harbor shrinking into a smear of gray and white. For a while she could still see the pier, that narrow finger of wood reaching into the sea, and then it vanished behind the curve of the land. Elena didn't cry. There was no reason to. Some endings didn't ask for tears. They asked for silence, for breath, for the simple courage to move. She leaned back against the seat and let the rhythm of the train carry her forward. The fields opened wide on either side, the light gathering as the day began. She reached into her coat pocket and felt for the compass, the small weight of it steady against her palm. When she looked down, the needle was pointing north. She smiled, faintly. Outside, the landscape shifted, dunes, low hills, the far-off gleam of another shore. The rails ran straight ahead, as if they knew exactly where to go. And for the first time in a long while, so did she. Chapter 3, Section 2. The Journey North. The train moved with a steady, unhurried rhythm, the kind that let thought wander but never drift too far. Elena sat by the window, her coat drawn close, watching the land stretch and fold outside. The first hours carried her through fields still pale with morning frost. Thin trees lined the horizon like sentinels, their branches bare but deliberate. From time to time the world would tilt, a small village flashing past, a road winding off toward somewhere unknown. She wondered what it was like to live in those places, to wake and never hear the sea. It felt impossible and peaceful all at once. Across the aisle sat a mother with a sleeping child in her arms. The child's head rested in the crook of her neck, the hair fine as thread. Elena watched them for a while, the quiet rhythm of their breathing matching the sway of the train. It stirred something soft in her, not quite longing, but memory, the echo of what might have been if time had broken differently. She turned back to the window. The fields gave way to open plains, then to low hills dotted with heather. The light changed too, sharper now, more northern, without the warmth of her old harbor. She could feel the difference in her bones, in the air that crept through the thin crack of the window. In the dining car, she ordered coffee. The cup rattled faintly in its saucer as she carried it back to her seat. The taste was bitter and thin, but the heat steadied her hands. She took out the compass and set it on her knee. The needle quivered as the train curved through a wide bend, then righted itself. North again, always north. A man across from her noticed it. "Old one, isn't it?" he said. His voice carried the rough edges of the coast, someone who knew salt and wind. It was, Elena said, belonged to a sailor. He nodded, as though that explained everything. "You heading north for work?" "Maybe," she said, "or something like it." He smiled, showing lines around his eyes. "The North doesn't care what you call it. It just takes you in, same as the tide." She liked that, the blunt truth of it. When he turned back to his paper, she looked down at the compass again and whispered, "Then let it take me." The train climbed gradually after noon, winding through darker hills. Rivers cut through stone, their surfaces silver and quick. She pressed her forehead to the cool glass, feeling the hum of motion beneath her skin. It was a sound that lived halfway between the heart and the rails. Once, she caught a glimpse of the coast, a line of white breakers against black rock. The sea again, though farther, colder. Her pulse quickened. It was like seeing an old friend across a crowded room, changed, but still known. As evening approached, the train began to slow. The passengers stirred, coats buttoned, papers folded, bags gathered from racks. The mother woke her child, whispering softly. Elena tucked the compass back into her pocket. Outside, the land was darker now, the light pulling away from the hills. The last of the sky burned faintly along the western rim. She could smell rain before it came, that clean, metallic promise. The voice of the conductor carried down the aisle, muffled but sure. Next stop, North Headland. She took a slow breath, then another. This was where Marta's brother would meet her. This was where the next part began. The train eased into the station, a platform lit by 2 weak lamps and a flickering sign. Beyond it, she could hear the sea again, louder this time, the surf rolling against the cliffs. It sounded rougher, older, more alive. When she stepped down onto the platform, the air cut sharp against her face. She lifted her collar and looked around. No faces she recognized, no voices she knew. Just the smell of salt and wood smoke, and the faint, rhythmic turning of a light somewhere far above the rocks. She smiled, not out of joy, but out of knowing she was finally somewhere new. Then she shouldered her bag and walked toward the edge of the platform, toward the sound of the sea. Chapter 3, Section 3. The Arrival, the Lighthouse Inn. The road wound up from the station in slow, deliberate turns. Jonas drove without speaking much, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the window where the cold air slipped in. The truck was old. It groaned with each hill, the frame trembling like an animal that had carried too much weight for too many years. Elena sat beside him, her bag between her feet, watching the land unfold in fragments through the windshield. The coastline here was sharper than the one she'd left behind. Cliffs rose out of the water like unfinished thoughts, dark and jagged, with white surf at their base. Grass clung to the edge in tufts, bent sideways by the wind. She could feel the seas pull even from the road, that deep, rhythmic insistence that had once unsettled her and now felt like a pulse she could rest against. Jonas pointed once toward the horizon. "Storm came through last week," he said. "Broke one of the buoys loose. Drifted 3 miles before they found it." Elena nodded. "You get storms often?" He gave a half-smile. "Often enough to name them." That was all he said for a while. The truck climbed another hill, and then the lighthouse came into view. It stood alone on the headland, white against the gray sky, tall and still as if holding its breath. Beside it, the inn, smaller, square, its windows facing the sea like watchful eyes. Smoke lifted thinly from the chimney, snatched and scattered by the wind. Jonas stopped near the door. "This is it," he said simply. Elena stepped out. The air hit her like something alive, cold, salted, moving. She could hear the waves breaking below, though she couldn't see them from where she stood. Only the sound, endless and even. Jonas came around and took her bag. "Rooms upstairs," he said. "Kitchen's through there." He nodded toward a narrow door at the side. "You'll get used to the wind. It never stops, but after a while, you don't notice." Inside, the inn smelled of cedar and coffee, with a faint trace of seaweed that clung to the walls. The light was dim, but steady, oil lamps burning low in iron brackets. Everything was simple: wood, stone, the rough weave of blankets folded neatly on a bench. A clock ticked from somewhere unseen, its rhythm matching the muffled sound of the surf below. Jonas set her bag down near the stairs. "You can rest a while," he said. "Dinner's at 7. Not much company here, but there's work if you want it." "I do," Elena said. He studied her for a moment, as though weighing the truth of her words, then nodded. "All right, you'll do fine." He left her there, the door closing softly behind him. Elena stood in the small front room, letting her eyes adjust. There was a window that faced west. She could see the faint sweep of the lighthouse beam passing every few seconds, slow and patient. It painted the room in pale light, then shadow, then light again. A heartbeat of brightness in the long dusk. She walked to the window and rested her hand against the glass. Below, the cliffs dropped straight into the sea. Spray lifted high where the waves struck the rocks, glowing white in the turning light. It was wild and raw and exact, the kind of beauty that didn't ask to be loved but dared you not to. Elena breathed in and let it out slowly. For the first time since she'd left home, she felt the weight inside her shift, not vanish, but settle. The silence here was different. It wasn't the silence of endings. It was the silence before something begins. Behind her, the floor creaked, Jonas returning, perhaps, or the wind itself finding its way through the boards. But she didn't turn. She stayed by the window, watching the lights sweep across the sea, again and again, like a promise made without words. Chapter 3, Section 4. The Quiet Work. The days fell into a rhythm before she realized they had. Mornings began with the sound of the wind sliding across the roof and the slow groan of the sea below. Elena would rise before the light reached the window, boil water for coffee, and sit at the kitchen table while the world turned gray to blue. Sometimes Jonas would join her, silent except for a low murmur of greeting. Other mornings he was already outside, walking the headland with his lantern before dawn. She learned the work in pieces. There were rooms to sweep, beds to turn, ledgers to keep in a neat hand. There were travelers sometimes, men from ships, a pair of surveyors, once an old couple tracing the coast in their retirement. They came and went with the weather, leaving only the faint smell of tobacco or soap behind them. When the inn was empty, she scrubbed the tables and mended what needed mending. Jonas spoke little, but his silence wasn't heavy. It was practical, like everything else about him. He had a way of moving through the space that made it seem natural, as though he'd been carved out of the same stone as the cliffs. In the evenings he'd sit by the window, reading the small pile of letters that arrived once a month and never seemed to bring surprise. Elena didn't ask about them. She suspected he wouldn't have minded if she did, but some things were better left unmeasured. The lighthouse itself fascinated her. She went there whenever she could, up the spiral stairs, past the thick iron railings and the smell of oil and salt. At the top, the lens turned in its slow, endless circle, throwing light across the sea in measured intervals. She would stand close enough to feel the faint warmth of it, her eyes following the sweep as it reached the horizon and came back again. The light never paused. It knew nothing of waiting. By the third week, the work had become second nature. She no longer thought about what she was doing. Her hands found the rhythm on their own. There was comfort in that, in the quiet repetition of small things done well. The body knew how to heal itself when given purpose. The heart took longer, but it followed. At night, after the lamps were out, she began to write. Not letters. She couldn't bring herself to address anyone yet, but small fragments. Descriptions, stray thoughts, lines that might have been beginnings of something if she'd been someone else. She kept them in a notebook she'd found in the kitchen drawer, its pages yellowed at the edges. Her handwriting grew steadier as the days went on. Once, during supper, Jonas said, "You keep busy." She smiled. "It keeps me still." He nodded, understanding without asking for more. The fire popped between them, and the wind pressed against the window. Outside, the beam from the lighthouse swept over the waves, turning the surface white for an instant before leaving it to the dark again. Later, in her room, she lay awake and listened. The sea had a different voice here, lower, more deliberate. It didn't crash or plead. It spoke in deep, even tones that seemed to say, "Stay a while, listen." Sometimes she did. Sometimes she imagined Daniel hearing the same sea somewhere far off, the same steady voice carried by the same wind. Other times she didn't think of him at all, and that startled her most of all. By the end of the month, the inn felt like part of her breathing, not a place she'd come to, but one she'd grown into. The work no longer filled the silence, it shaped it, and the silence no longer frightened her. It began to sound, faintly, like peace. Chapter 3, Section 5. The Stranger. The storm came in fast from the west. By dusk, the clouds had turned the color of lead, and the wind drove the rain sideways against the windows. Jonas went down to the jetty to tie the boats, his figure shrinking to a dark blur against the foam. Elena stood in the doorway for a time, watching the sea come apart in great white strokes. The lighthouse beam swept across it, unbothered. Light, dark, steady as breath. Inside, the inn felt smaller, wrapped tight against the weather. She fed the fire, set a pot of soup on the stove, and listened to the sound of the rain hammering the roof. It wasn't fear she felt, not anymore, but a sharp, restless awareness, as if the air itself had grown charged. Storms always made her think of arrivals. Nothing ever seemed to begin on a calm day. It was near full dark when she heard the knock. A heavy, deliberate sound, not hurried, not hesitant. She opened the door, and there he was, a man in a soaked coat, water running from his hat brim to the floorboards. He looked like he'd stepped straight out of the sea. "Evening," he said, voice rough from wind. "I saw the light." Elena nodded, stepping back. "Come in before you drown standing." He did. The smell of salt and rain filled the room. She fetched a towel from the peg, handed it to him. He took it with a small nod, wringing out his sleeves before wiping his face. "Boat?" she asked. He shook his head. "On foot, mostly. Caught the wrong end of the storm on the ridge." Jonas returned just then, dripping and silent, his boots leaving a trail on the floor. He took one look at the stranger, then at Elena, and said only, "You'll need a bed, then." The man smiled faintly. "If there's one to spare." "There's always one," Jonas said. He turned to Elena. "Soup ready?" She nodded. They ate together, the three of them, the sound of wind pressing against the walls. The stranger ate like someone who hadn't in a while, but without greed. When he finally spoke, it was soft, almost as if he were remembering how. "Stronger storm than it looked from the ridge," he said. "Whole sky dropped in one piece." Jonas grunted. "That's the sea for you. Always looks gentler from a distance." The stranger's eyes flicked to Elena. "Doesn't it?" She met his gaze, felt something tighten in her chest. Not recognition, not yet, but something adjacent to it. It was his voice. There was a note in it, a low hum she couldn't place, that brushed against memory like a faint echo. Daniel had once hummed like that when he worked the nets, without realizing it. "You're from the South," she said, almost to herself. He tilted his head. "You can tell." "The vowels," she said, "and the way you look at the sea." He smiled at that, small but real. "You've been watching it a long time, then." "All my life." He nodded, as if that made them kin. "Name's Aaron," he said finally. "Elena." Jonas cleared his throat. "You'll sleep upstairs, room at the end of the hall. Storm will last the night. Best stay put." Aaron thanked him. When he rose from the table, his shoulders cast a long shadow across the wall. There was a quietness to him, but not the heavy kind. The kind that carried its own center, calm even in wind. He climbed the stairs without sound. Jonas lingered only a moment. "You can tell a man's story by the way he eats in a storm," he said. Elena looked up. "And what's his story?" "Still hungry," Jonas said, and went out to check the shutters. When the door closed behind him, Elena sat by the fire. The rain had eased to a steady hiss. She could hear the lighthouse turning, a faint, mechanical heartbeat in the dark. Above, a floorboard creaked, Aaron moving in his room. She reached for her notebook but didn't open it. Instead, she let her hand rest on the cover, listening to the rain and the soft rhythm of the sea returning to itself. Something in the house had shifted, small, invisible, but real. Not the kind of change you could name, only the kind you felt. When she finally rose to douse the fire, she looked once toward the stairs. The lamp flickered, and for a breath of time, she thought she heard humming. The same slow tune Daniel used to hum when the work was done and the sea was kind. But when she listened harder, there was only the wind. Chapter 3, Section 6, The Light Turning. The storm passed sometime after midnight. Elena woke to the quiet, that rare, complete kind of quiet that only follows after a long night of wind. The rain had stopped, the air felt rinsed, and the house seemed to be listening to its own stillness. She rose, wrapped herself in her coat, and lit a lamp. The flame flared, then steadied, a small warm circle against the dark. Jonas's door was shut. She could hear him breathing in sleep. From above came the faint sound of movement, Aaron shifting in his bed or dreaming. She crossed the narrow passage to the lighthouse door. The hinges moaned softly as she pushed it open. Inside, the stone was cold beneath her feet, damp with the breath of the sea. She climbed the spiral stairs slowly, one hand on the iron rail, the lamp swinging at her side. The higher she went, the more she could feel the wind again, not wild now, just constant, brushing against the glass of the tower. When she reached the top, the lens turned in its slow, perfect rhythm. It filled the room with moving light, gold, silver, shadow, gold again. The beam swept across the sea, far and steady, like a thought carried on into distance. She set the lamp down and stepped closer to the window. Below, the water was calm now, the surface broken only by the faint glow of foam on the rocks. The horizon had begun to pale, not yet dawn, but the promise of it. Elena leaned her forehead against the cool glass. She thought of the storm, the knock at the door, the man who'd arrived out of the dark. Aaron. The name still felt unfinished in her mind, like the beginning of a sentence she hadn't decided to say aloud. She took the compass from her pocket. It was still damp from the air, the metal cold to the touch. The needle moved, then steadied, north again, unwavering. She smiled, faintly. Somewhere out there, beyond that direction, Daniel had vanished into his own horizon. She felt no bitterness now, only the kind of ache that becomes a part of breathing. People left. People returned. The sea did both every day, and it never asked permission. The light turned again, slow and certain. She followed it with her eyes, the way one follows a memory that no longer hurts. Behind her, the door at the base of the stairs creaked open. Footsteps climbed, unhurried but deliberate. She didn't turn until Aaron's voice came softly through the turning light. Couldn't sleep either? She shook her head. Too quiet after all that noise. He came to stand beside her, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. The light caught his face in pieces, half shadow, half gold, making him look both near and far. Beautiful, he said. Yes. They stood without speaking for a while, watching the beams sweep the sea. Each turn lit the waves, the rocks, the long black line of horizon, and then darkness again. It was a pattern that made sense. Reveal, conceal, return. Maybe that was all life was. After some time, he said, "You ever think about what it looks like from out there, when they see this light?" "All the time," she said. He nodded. "It's strange, isn't it? We stand here watching it leave, and someone miles away thinks it's coming toward them." Elena looked at him, the faintest smile playing at her lips. Maybe both are true. He smiled back, slow, as if testing the idea. Below them, the wind rose again, gentle this time, carrying the sound of the sea brushing against the cliffs. The horizon was beginning to open, the first thin line of dawn spreading across the water. The light turned once more, touching them both for an instant before moving on. Elena slipped the compass back into her pocket. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel lost. The world hadn't changed, only her place within it. She whispered, almost to herself, "The light keeps turning." Aaron looked at her, then out at the sea. "It always does." And they stood there, side by side, the beams circling above them, the sky slowly brightening. Two small figures in the tower's glow, watching the night lift from the water, and the world begin again. Chapter 4, Section 1, Morning Light. The morning came in pale and quiet, the kind of light that doesn't rush itself. It slipped through the small window by her bed and settled on the floorboards, soft and thin as gauze. For a while, Elena just lay there, eyes half open, listening. The sea had changed again, no longer the deep growl of storm, but a slow breathing, steady and calm. Every sound in the house seemed to belong to it. The tick of the clock, the faint movement of air under the door, her own pulse. She rose and dressed without hurry. The room smelled of salt and damp linen, the scent of the night the storm had left behind. When she opened the window, the wind that came through was clean and sharp, carrying the faint sweetness of seaweed and pine from the cliffs. The air had that washed feeling, as if the world had been rinsed in silence. Downstairs, the hearth was cold. She coaxed a new flame from last night's ashes, breathing gently until it caught. The light flickered across the stone walls, and she stood there a moment, warming her hands. A kettle hung by the hook. She filled it from the pump and set it to boil. Each small act had its rhythm, quiet, precise, human. Outside, the world was still dripping. Rainwater clung to the eaves, fell one drop at a time into the puddles below. The path to the line where she dried the linens was slick and dark. She carried the basket out, the cloth folded neat against her chest. The wind lifted her hair when she stepped into the open air. She pegged the first sheet by its corner. It flapped once, then filled with the breeze, bright and white against the gray. The second sheet followed, then the third. Soon the line shimmered like a sail unfurling at sea. She felt something uncoil inside her as she worked. Something she hadn't known was still tight. Footsteps crunched behind her on the gravel path. She turned and saw Aaron, carrying an armful of driftwood, his sleeves rolled, hair still damp. He raised a hand, not quite a wave, more a greeting shaped by the morning. "You're early," she said. He shrugged, smiling. "Couldn't sleep. Storm's air always keeps me half awake the next day. You're not the only one." He set the wood by the door and stood for a moment, looking out toward the sea. The tide was low, the rocks glistening like black glass. A gull called once, lazy and satisfied. Hard to believe it was the same water tearing at us last night, he said. She nodded. The sea forgets faster than we do. He looked at her then, really looked, and said, maybe that's why we keep coming back to it. Elena smiled, faint and tired but true. Maybe. They worked side by side for a while. She with the linens, he with the wood. The sound of cloth snapping in the wind mixed with the scrape of bark and the quiet rhythm of breathing. No need for talk. The morning didn't want talk, it wanted presence. When they finished, she poured coffee in 2 chipped mugs and handed him one. The steam rose between them. He nodded thanks and took a sip, closing his eyes. Better than anything I've had in a long time, he said. It's just coffee. That's what makes it good. They stood there, watching the sky clear over the water. The light shifted again, softer now, finding its way into the folds of the world. Elena felt it on her face, warm and fragile. It had been a long time since she'd let light touch her without pulling away. For a while neither of them spoke. It wasn't silence, exactly. It was a kind of understanding, something unspoken that grew naturally between them, like the tide filling a hollow. The world seemed to breathe with them. Then Aaron said quietly, I've got to go into town later. Jonas says we're low on oil. I can carry the tins back if you're heading that way. Maybe, she said. We'll see what the day wants. He smiled, a slow, knowing kind of smile, and turned toward the shed. The sun had begun to find its way through the thinning clouds. The sea glimmered, new and familiar all at once. Elena stood there alone for a while longer, the last sheet lifting gently on the line. The world smelled clean, like first chances. She took another sip of coffee, its warmth grounding her in the quiet. For the first time in months, she didn't think of yesterday. She only thought of the morning, the sound of water, and the way the air felt full of possible things. Chapter 4, Section 2, The Errand. By mid-morning the light had strengthened, gold slipping through the mist that still clung to the cliffs. Jonas had gone down to the jetty to inspect the ropes, and when he came back he stood in the doorway a while, stamping salt from his boots. He looked older in the daylight, the kind of tired that comes from a life that never quite lets you rest. Elena, he said, we're low on oil and flour. Town'll be busy after the storm. Better to go early. He set a few coins on the table, the metal clinking against the wood. Take the handcart. Aaron can help if he's willing. Aaron was already by the door, tightening the strap on his satchel. I was heading that way, he said. Could use a walk that isn't uphill for once. Jonas grunted, half a smile, half a warning. Don't get lost in the talk down there. They'll have 100 stories about the storm. They always do, Elena said, reaching for her shawl. Outside, the path into town ran along the bluff and then down through a narrow strip of pines. The ground was soft from the night's rain, smelling of earth and resin. They walked without hurry, the cart wheels squeaking behind them. The sea kept close to their left, flashing silver through the gaps in the trees. For a while, neither spoke. It wasn't an awkward silence, just the natural kind that fills itself with sound. Birds, wind, the distant hiss of waves breaking. Then Aaron said, You've walked this road before. Many times, she said. When I was younger, I used to think it was the edge of the world. And now, she smiled. Now I know it's just the edge of this place. The world keeps going past it. He nodded, looking ahead. That's a good thing to remember. They reached the slope that curved down toward the lowlands. Pools of rainwater shimmered in the ruts, reflecting the sky like fragments of another world. Aaron stopped once to push the wheel free from the mud, his hand steady on the handle. Jonas said you came here from the south, she said after a time. That true? It is. What brought you north? He hesitated, not out of secrecy, but because words sometimes take time to find their right shape. Work mostly, then something else. I stayed. Something else. He smiled, glancing at her. Quiet. The kind that doesn't ask questions. Elena nodded. That's rare. It is. But I think I was ready for it. The sun broke through the last thin sheet of cloud then, spilling light across the water. They both stopped for a moment to look. The sea spread wide and shining beneath them. The kind of view that made you remember how small you were and how much that didn't matter. You ever think of leaving? He asked quietly. She thought for a long time before answering. I did. For years, that was all I thought about. But leaving isn't always distance. Sometimes it's forgetting. And forgetting is another kind of sea. Aaron nodded, slow. Harder to cross. Yes. The road leveled out, the air warming as they neared town. Children were already playing near the harbor, throwing sticks into the receding tide. The smell of fish and tar came with the wind, sharp, honest smells that belonged to work and living. Elena watched the gulls wheel above the water. Funny thing, she said. When you come down here after a storm, everything looks cleaner. But underneath, it's the same sea. Maybe that's what storms are for, he said. To remind us what's underneath. She looked at him, and he met her gaze. There was something steady in his eyes, not pity, not desire, just presence. It felt like sunlight after a long fog. They walked the rest of the way in quiet, the sound of the cart wheels rolling over cobblestone filling the space between them. The town rose ahead, its rooftops shining wet and bright in the late morning light. For the first time in a long while, Elena found herself looking forward, not to arrival, not to what might be waiting, but simply to the walk itself. The air, the road, the company. And though she didn't say it aloud, she thought, this is what beginning feels like. Not loud, not sudden, just steady. Chapter 4, Section 3, The Market. The town sat low in the curve of the bay, its roofs dark with rain and its streets still wet. The scent of fish, yeast, and salt mingled in the air, the living smell of a place that never stopped working. Boats rocked gently at their moorings, ropes creaking, sails slack against the masts. Elena felt the hum of the place before she heard it, the clatter of crates, the sharp calls of vendors, the muted talk of people relieved to have weathered another storm. They passed the blacksmith shop first, its windows fogged with heat. A child sat on the step outside, counting coins in his palm. Then the row of stalls began, cloth, bread, dried fish, all the same faces she remembered from before. The world had changed since she last walked here, but the market hadn't. It was still the same small theater of voices and gestures, the same familiar chaos. Aaron stopped at a stall selling salt cod and spoke with the fishmonger, an old man with hands rough as rope. Elena watched them trade a few quiet words. There was ease in the way Aaron spoke, not the practiced talk of someone used to charm, but the unhurried rhythm of someone who had learned to listen. She lingered a little apart, pretending to study the jars of preserves, but mostly she was watching. Then she heard her name. Elena. It was Marta, standing in the doorway of the cafe with her apron dusted in flour. Her eyes widened, and the smile that followed was full of surprise and warmth. You're here. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten us. Elena laughed softly. Not forgotten. Just away. Marta stepped closer, wiping her hands on her apron. You look well, she said, tilting her head. Different, maybe. Calmer. Storms will do that, Elena said. Or what comes after them, Marta replied, her gaze kind but curious. Her eyes flicked toward Aaron, who was now carrying a sack of flour back toward the cart. And who's that? A traveler, Elena said. He's been helping Jonas at the inn. Marta nodded, the faintest hint of amusement on her lips. A traveler. She said it the way one says we'll see. Elena smiled, knowing that tone well. Don't start. I'm not starting. I'm only observing. Marta's eyes softened. You've always needed someone to remind you that life doesn't stop just because we do. Elena looked down at her hands. I know. Then you're already halfway back, Marta said. Sit, at least for a cup of coffee. It's stronger today. I think the storm woke the beans. Elena laughed, the sound startling even herself. Maybe on the way back. Marta touched her arm briefly. You still know where to find me. Aaron rejoined her then, setting the sack in the cart with a soft thud. All set, he said. Flour, oil, and a warning from the blacksmith that his roof may not survive the next storm. Tell him the roofs survived worse, Elena said. Aaron smiled. I'll deliver that myself next time. As they started back through the crowd, Marta called after her. Elena, come by soon. You look like someone who's got stories again. The words followed her a while, soft and persistent as the sea breeze. They walked down toward the docks. The tide was coming in slow, the water lapping against the posts. Children were chasing each other along the edge, their laughter thin and high in the salt air. Aaron stopped to buy 2 apples from a boy with a wooden crate. He handed her one without a word. They ate as they walked, juice running down their fingers, the taste sharp and clean. Friend of yours? Aaron asked after a moment. Marta. She runs the cafe. We used to talk. Back when talking still came easily. He nodded, chewing thoughtfully. Seems she still has words enough for two. She always did. They passed the end of the pier, where the water deepened and turned dark blue. Elena paused, looking out toward the horizon. The sea was calm again, but she could still feel the memory of its strength, the way it had pulled at the world only a night ago. Aaron followed her gaze. You ever get used to it? The water changing so fast. She thought for a long moment before answering. You don't get used to it. You just learn to let it. He nodded, understanding more than she expected. The wind picked up, teasing at the edge of her shawl. Behind them, the market carried on, the hum of life returning, stubborn and alive. Elena felt something shift inside her, subtle but sure. The sense that she was no longer only passing through this place, but returning to it. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like a visitor in her own story. Chapter 4, Section 4, Stories by the Fire. The road back from town was quieter. By the time they reached the rise above the bay, the light had begun to thin, that late afternoon gold that softens everything it touches. The air was still, the kind of stillness that comes after a long day of labor, when even the sea seems content to rest. Jonas was sitting by the door when they returned, a knife in one hand, mending a length of rope. He looked up once, nodded, and went back to his work. Get what we need? More or less, Elena said, lifting the sack of flour from the cart. Jonas grunted. Then we'll eat like kings. He smiled faintly and stood, his knees stiff. Give me a hand with the wood, Aaron. They stacked logs near the hearth, the scrape of bark and the soft thud of wood against stone filling the room. Elena set water to boil, her movements easy from habit. The smell of coffee and smoke began to rise, warm, earthy, homelike. When the fire caught, the room filled with light that seemed to come from the center of things. Later, when they'd eaten fish stew, bread, a small wedge of cheese, they stayed by the fire. The air outside had cooled, a fine mist drifted from the sea. Inside, the fire made the shadows dance along the walls, soft and slow. Jonas poured each of them a small glass of brandy. He held his up briefly, not as a toast, but as an offering. To quiet nights, he said. Aaron raised his glass. And mornings that still surprise us. They drank. The warmth spread through the room, not from the fire alone, but from something quieter, something unspoken. Jonas leaned back in his chair. Tell us a story, Aaron. You've been north, haven't you? Seen more water than any of us. Aaron looked into his glass for a long moment before speaking. There's a harbor up past Kalvik, he said slowly. Barely a harbor, really. Just a curve in the rocks. The sea there's colder, meaner. You don't see it, you feel it. Elena listened, her elbows on her knees, her hands wrapped around her cup. I was there one winter, Aaron continued. We anchored 3 days waiting for ice to break. Nothing to do but mend nets and talk. There was an old man on board, a sailor all his life. He said the sea keeps what it wants and returns what it can't hold. At the time, I thought he meant wreckage. Later I realized he meant people. Jonas nodded, quiet. He wasn't wrong. Aaron's voice lowered. When the thaw came, we found a boat half buried in the inlet. No name, no sign of who'd owned it. Just a bit of rope caught in the rudder. We cut it loose and let it drift again. The old man said it was better that way. Let the sea decide the rest. The fire popped once, sharp and clean. For a while, no one spoke. The room held that silence the way a shell holds the sound of the tide. Elena looked at Aaron, at the way the light moved across his face, the steady calm in his eyes. Something in his story had settled deep in her, though she couldn't say what. Maybe it was the idea of the sea deciding what it keeps. Maybe it was the quiet acceptance in his voice when he said it. Jonas broke the silence first. That's a good story. The kind worth keeping. Aaron smiled slightly. Some stories keep themselves. Elena met his gaze. And some find their way back. Even when you think they're gone. He looked at her then. A long, small look that said he understood more than she'd meant to share. Outside, the fog pressed against the window, the world beyond it faint and shapeless. Jonas rose, stretching. That'll do for one night. The seas settled. I'll check the lantern before bed. He left them there, the fire dimming to embers. Elena leaned back, feeling the heat fade against her legs. Aaron sat across from her, his glass untouched now, turning it slowly in his hands. You tell stories often? She asked. Only when the silence asks for one. She smiled at that. And what does the silence ask for now? He looked into the fire. Maybe nothing. Maybe just to be heard. They sat a while longer, saying nothing more. The only sound was the steady rhythm of the waves outside and the slow breathing of the house around them. When Elena finally stood, she felt the weight of the day lift from her shoulders, replaced by something softer, steadier. At the door, she paused. "Good night, Aaron." He looked up, the faintest trace of a smile in his eyes. "Good night, Elena." As she climbed the stairs, the floorboards creaked beneath her feet. The fire's glow followed her a little way, fading with each step. By the time she reached her room, the world below had gone quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet now, the kind that listens back. Chapter 4, Section 5. The letter returned. The next morning broke gray and still. The sea was flat as glass, its color caught somewhere between silver and pewter. Mist lay low over the harbor, softening everything. The rocks, the boats, even the sound of gulls. Elena stood by the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. Jonas came in from the path with the post bag slung over his shoulder. The oilskin was slick with dew, his boots leaving faint prints on the floor. He set the bag on the table and began to sort through it, muttering to himself. Invoice, advertisement for a tractor no one asked for. He paused, frowning. Then he held up a single envelope, its edges curled from damp. "This one's for you." Elena took it, her breath catching as she saw the handwriting. It was hers. The envelope was marked in red, "Return to sender." A thin, official hand had drawn a line through the name she had written months ago, Daniel Ward. Jonas must have seen something in her face because his voice softened. "Happens more often than you'd think," he said. "People move on. Port's close. Names fade." She nodded, unable to speak. When he left, she sat for a long while staring at the envelope. The ink had bled slightly where the rain had touched it, smearing the loops of her writing. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried not words, but time itself. She slipped it open. Inside was the letter she had written after Daniel's death, or what she thought was his death. The one she'd mailed on a night when she could no longer bear silence. The page smelled faintly of salt and smoke. Her own handwriting looked foreign to her now, younger, desperate, full of pleading she could hardly stand to read. She didn't read it. She folded it back, slowly, carefully, as though the act itself might close something. Then she went outside. The mist was beginning to lift, revealing the long sweep of the shore. She walked until she reached the line where the wet sand met the dry, the letter still in her hand. Out on the water, the tide was moving in, smooth and patient. Aaron's voice came from behind her. "I saw Jonas hand you something." She turned, the letter loose in her fingers. It came back. He stepped closer, his coat collar turned up against the wind. "Bad news." "No news," she said. "Worse, maybe." He waited, saying nothing. She looked down at the envelope again. "I wrote it after I thought he was gone. I sent it to the only address I had. It found its way back here. Maybe that's the sea's way of returning what it can't keep," he said gently. Elena smiled faintly. "Jonas told you that story?" Aaron shook his head. "You did, without meaning to." The wind rose a little, tugging at the letter. For a moment, she almost let it go, imagined it lifting from her hand, carried off toward the horizon, dissolving into distance. But something in her stopped. She crouched instead and pressed it flat against the sand, weighting it with a small stone. Aaron watched her, his face unreadable. "It feels wrong to throw it away," she said. "But wrong to keep it too." He nodded. "Then leave it for the tide. It'll decide for you." She looked at him, and there was kindness in his voice, but no softness. It was the kind of kindness that made space for truth. The waves crept closer, each one reaching a little farther. She could feel the moisture gather on her skin, the faint salt sting on her lips. When the first wave touched the paper, it darkened instantly. The ink blurred, the words dissolving into the sea's gray shimmer. Elena stood, the stone tumbling away. By the time the next wave came, there was nothing left of the letter. Aaron said quietly, "There's your answer." "Maybe." She turned toward him. Or maybe that was the question. He smiled, not to dismiss her words, but to honor them. They began to walk back along the shore, slow, unhurried. Behind them, the tide erased every trace of their steps, folding the past neatly into itself. When they reached the edge of the path, Elena looked back once more. The sea had already forgotten. But she hadn't, not entirely. What she felt now wasn't grief or guilt. It was something lighter, like space. She touched the compass in her pocket, the small weight of it familiar and grounding. It didn't point anywhere new, but for the first time, that didn't matter. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of gulls and the promise of clear sky. Aaron walked beside her, hands in his coat pockets, silent. They didn't need to speak. The morning had already said enough. Chapter 4, Section 6. The Lantern. By evening, the mist had lifted, leaving the air bright and brittle. The sky was a hard blue fading toward violet, the kind of color that seems to hum with its own light. Elena stood outside the inn, a lantern in her hands. Its glass was smudged, the handle warm from use. She had cleaned it earlier, polished the brass, trimmed the wick. It burned steady now, the flame sure and low. The sea below was restless again, though not angry, just alive. The tide drew close, then slipped away, whispering against the stones. Jonas had gone down to the dock to secure the boats. Aaron was inside, stacking kindling for the night. For the first time in a long while, Elena didn't feel the need to be anywhere else. She carried the lantern to the edge of the bluff. The wind tugged at her hair, cool and constant. From here, she could see the whole curve of the bay, the dark line of the horizon, the faint pulse of the lighthouse far to the north. That light had guided them once, years ago, when the sea had been both their refuge and their undoing. Now it flickered like a quiet echo, a promise kept only by habit. Aaron's footsteps approached behind her, soft on the damp earth. "You always light it yourself?" he asked. "Jonas usually does," she said. "But I like to see the first flame." He stood beside her, hands in his pockets. "There's something about light in the dark that feels earned." She looked out over the water. "Or temporary. Maybe that's what makes it matter." They stood without speaking for a time. The lantern's glow swayed gently between them, gold against the gathering dusk. Down in the harbor, a bell rang once. A small, solitary sound carried thin by the wind. Elena thought of the letter again, now part of the tide, gone where all things unfinished eventually go. It hadn't given her peace, not exactly, but it had made room for something quieter. In that room, she felt a strange kind of gratitude, not for what had been lost, but for what had managed to remain. "You ever think about leaving?" Aaron asked softly. "I used to," she said. "Every day? Then less. Then not at all." He nodded. "Sometimes staying is the harder thing." "Yes," she said, "but it's also the truer one." The wind picked up, rattling the lantern glass. The flame shivered but held. Aaron reached out, steadying it with his hand. His fingers brushed hers, just enough to make her draw breath. Neither of them moved away. The sea below sighed against the rocks. Somewhere in the distance, a gull called once, then was gone. The light from the lantern cast their shadows long across the ground, two figures standing close, the edges almost touching. Elena turned slightly toward him. "You'll be leaving soon, won't you?" "Tomorrow," he said. "Jonas asked me to carry word north. Supplies. The usual excuses. And after that," he looked at her, and for the first time, his eyes were unguarded. "After that, I don't know. I stopped planning a while ago." She nodded, accepting it, though a part of her wanted more. The silence between them felt full, like the air before rain. He glanced at the lantern. "You'll keep it burning? As long as there's something worth seeing by its light." Aaron smiled, small, real, almost sad. "Then I hope it never goes out." He turned and started back toward the inn, his figure growing dim in the falling dark. Elena stayed where she was, the lantern warm in her hands. When she finally set it down on the stone ledge, she watched the flame a long time. It flickered, bent with the wind, then steadied again, stubborn, alive. Below, the sea rolled on, unending, unanswerable. She thought of Daniel, of the years that had folded into silence, of the letter now somewhere in the deep. Then she thought of Aaron, and of the look in his eyes. Not promise, not rescue, but recognition. The kind that says, "I see you still here." The horizon dimmed, the last light fading to gray. Elena turned toward the inn, leaving the lantern burning where it stood. Behind her, the flame swayed once, then caught itself, holding fast against the wind. Chapter 5, Section 1. The Departure. Morning came cold and pale. The light was thin, colorless, the kind that makes the world feel undecided. The harbor was quiet except for the slow knock of water against the hulls and the low murmur of men preparing the boats. Elena watched from the rise above the dock, her shawl pulled tight against the wind. Aaron stood below, his coat collar turned up, a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He moved with that same measured calm she had come to recognize, a man who had learned the discipline of leaving. Jonas spoke with him in short, practical phrases, the state of the tide, the condition of the rope, the forecast of weather. Their voices carried faintly up the slope, blending with the creak of wood and the gull's sharp cries. When he saw her, Aaron lifted a hand, just a brief motion, but enough. She went down to meet him, the wet sand giving slightly under her boots. "You're early," she said. He smiled. "It's easier that way." "Easier for whom?" "For no one," he said. "But it keeps the goodbyes short." She nodded, knowing that truth. "You'll head north?" "For now." He glanced toward the horizon, where the line between sea and sky was still blurred. "The world's quiet up there. Cold, but honest." There was a small pause between them, filled with everything that hadn't been said. She reached into her coat and pulled something from her pocket. A folded piece of paper, worn soft at the edges. "This is for you," she said. "It isn't a letter. Just a name. A place, if you ever come south again." Aaron took it carefully. "I'll keep it safe." "You don't have to. I will anyway." They stood that way for a moment, two people at the edge of something they didn't know how to name. Behind them, Jonas called out, "Tide's turning." The gulls rose with the sound, their wings catching the new light. Aaron slung his bag higher on his shoulder. "You'll look after the lantern?" "It's still burning," she said. "Hasn't gone out yet." "Good." He hesitated, then added, "It shouldn't." He offered his hand. She took it, her fingers cold against his. There was no ceremony in the gesture, no promise. It was simply an acknowledgement of time shared, of silence survived. Then he let go, and the moment broke. He stepped aboard the small vessel, the plank creaking under his weight. Jonas gave a last nod from the dock, then climbed in after him. Elena stayed on the shore as they pushed off. The oars dipped and rose, the boat cutting through the still water, leaving a dark trail that quickly closed behind it. The mist began to lift again, and soon their figures were little more than shapes against the gray. She stood there long after they were gone. The sea had that strange quiet it sometimes held, not absence, but waiting, the kind of quiet that asks you what comes next. Elena looked down at her hands. They were steady. She turned toward the path that led back to the inn. The wind shifted at her back, carrying the faint scent of salt and pine. Somewhere far out, a bell rang once. A single clear note that hung in the air, then faded. It sounded like an ending, but it might also have been a beginning. Chapter 5, Section 2, The Empty Room. The inn felt different the moment she stepped inside. It wasn't the silence that had always been there, but something subtler, the way air holds its breath after a door closes. The faint scent of oil and salt lingered, the kind that clings to a man's clothes after weeks near the sea. It would fade soon. Everything did. She set her shawl on the peg by the door and stood for a long moment, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light. The morning's gray had turned the walls soft and colorless. The fire had gone out hours ago, leaving only the faint smell of ash. She knelt, stirred the coals, and built it back from habit, the small domestic resurrection of flame. When the wood caught, the room came alive again, just a little. She made coffee. The sound of it bubbling in the pot filled the space like a low hum, steady and human. Outside, the gulls still cried, though they sounded farther away now, as if the harbor itself had drifted. She carried her cup upstairs. His door was open, not wide, just enough to show the corner of the bed and the folded blanket at its foot. She paused there, her hand resting on the frame. The room was tidy, spare. A chair by the window, a small table, the faint impression of a man's life passing quietly through a place. She stepped inside, the boards creaking under her weight. On the table, a glass of water stood half full. He had forgotten it, or maybe he had left it that way, something unfinished, like a breath held. There was a small scrap of paper beneath the glass, held down so it wouldn't move with the draft. She lifted it carefully. It wasn't a note, not really. Just a single line in his careful, deliberate hand. "The tide keeps what it can hold." That was all. No signature, no farewell. She read it twice, then set it back where it had been. Through the window, she could see the sea again, distant, bright now under the new sun. The boat would be well past the outer shoals by now, heading north toward colder waters. Elena sat in the chair by the window. The room was cool still. For a long time she listened, not for footsteps, not for a voice, just for the sound of the world settling back into itself. A floorboard creaked somewhere below. The kettle whistled faintly. The gulls turned in the air. She looked again at the note. The words seemed simple, but they carried a weight she could feel deep in her chest. Maybe it was his way of saying goodbye. Or maybe it was something else, a reminder that not everything lost is taken. She folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket. Then she stood, took one last look around the room, and closed the door softly behind her. Downstairs, the fire had burned low again. She sat at the table, wrapped her hands around her cup, and watched the light shift across the floor. The day was moving on without her, as days do, but she didn't rush to meet it. For the first time in years, she felt the strange, steady calm of being alone, not abandoned, not waiting, just alone. And in that quiet, she realized it wasn't emptiness she felt at all. It was space, the kind that makes room for whatever might come next. Chapter 5, Section 3, The Letter in the Journal. The afternoon passed slowly, the kind of slow that feels like a test. Elena moved through the inn in quiet rhythm, washing the cups, sweeping the floor, folding linens that didn't need folding. Every task was small and exact, her hands remembering the motions before her mind caught up. It was a way of keeping time without thinking about it. By mid-afternoon, the light changed. The fog that had lingered near the harbor began to thin, and the sun came through in soft, broken shapes across the floorboards. She followed that light into the storage room at the back of the house, a place she hadn't entered in months. The air inside was cool and dry, smelling faintly of dust and cedar. Boxes were stacked neatly against one wall, their edges labeled in Jonas's careful handwriting. Tools, nails, maps. In the far corner stood an old wooden trunk she recognized at once, Daniel's. It was the same trunk they'd taken on the boat their first summer together. He had carved his initials into the lid, D.W. The letters were worn now, the grooves darkened with age. She touched them lightly, the tips of her fingers tracing the shape of memory. For a long time she just stood there, uncertain. Then she lifted the lid. Inside were small things, a worn wool sweater, a compass whose needle no longer moved, a length of rope tied neatly in a coil. Beneath them lay a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and salt-stained. She hesitated, then picked it up. The first few pages were filled with notes, short entries about the weather, the tides, the kind of things sailors write when they need to make sense of endless days. But as she turned the pages, the writing changed. The entries grew longer, more personal, the handwriting less steady. She stopped when she reached the one that began with her name. Elena, it read. If you ever read this, it means I didn't make it back to you, or I made it back too late. I never knew which would be worse. Her breath caught. The page trembled slightly in her hands. You were right about the sea. It doesn't forgive, and it doesn't forget. But it teaches. It makes you small enough to see what matters. I used to think I left to save you from the life we were sinking into. Truth is, I left because I was afraid of what staying would make of me, of what loving you had already made of me. The words blurred. She blinked hard and read on. If I find my way home, I'll tell you this in person. If not, I hope this finds its way to you the way the tide finds the shore, slow, certain, and without reason. There was no date, no signature, just a smudge of ink near the bottom where the pen must have faltered. She closed the journal slowly, holding it against her chest. The air in the room felt thicker now, full of everything that had been left unsaid between them. She sat on the trunk, the journal in her lap, and listened to the faint sound of the waves beyond the walls. So he had written to her. Maybe he had never sent it. Maybe it had never been meant to reach her at all. But it was here now, in her hands, carried somehow across all those empty years. A strange calm settled over her. Not peace exactly, but the recognition of something completed. The circle closed, imperfectly, but closed all the same. She placed the journal beside her, its leather warm from her touch, and looked toward the small square of window. The light had softened into gold, the kind that made the sea look endless again. Elena whispered, not to anyone, not even to herself, I got it. Then she stood, leaving the trunk open and the room behind her. The air in the hallway smelled faintly of salt and smoke. Somewhere below, the kettle began to whistle, calling her back to the living world. Chapter 5, Section 4. The Lantern Room. Dusk had settled by the time she reached the narrow stairs that led to the lantern room. They were steep and uneven, the wood worn smooth by years of feet and salt. She carried the journal in one hand, a small lantern in the other, its light shifting with each step. The air grew cooler as she climbed, the smell of oil and the faint tang of rust thickening around her. At the top, she pushed open the hatch. The evening light poured in, that soft, suspended blue that belongs only to the hour before night. The sea stretched out below, calm and immense, its surface broken now and then by a silver flash of fish. The horizon was clean and straight, like a line drawn between what was gone and what remained. The great lamp stood silent at the center of the room. Jonas had cleaned the lenses that morning, and they caught the fading light like a handful of captured sun. Elena set her lantern on the floor beside the mechanism, then sat by the window where the glass curved outward into the open air. She placed the journal on her knees. The wind hummed softly through the cracks. She could hear the slow rhythm of waves below, the steady breathing of the world. For a long while, she didn't open the book. She simply looked at it, the worn leather, the faded stitching, and thought of Daniel's hands. He had written these words somewhere between storms, probably in the narrow dark of a ship's cabin, when the only sound was the scrape of the hull and the water's low whisper. She could almost see him there, hunched over the page, his eyes reflecting the same flicker of light that now touched hers. When she finally opened the journal, she turned to the last page. There were only a few lines written, the ink faint but legible. The sea doesn't end. It only turns back on itself. If she's reading this, then I've made it home in the only way I could. Her throat tightened. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they hadn't said in life. A kind of answer, or maybe a release. She closed the book and rested her palm against the cover. The surface was warm now from her touch. Outside, the first stars had appeared, faint at first, then slowly brightening against the deepening sky. She stood and crossed to the great lantern. Its mechanism was silent, waiting. She struck a match, the sulfur flaring sharp in the dim room, and touched it to the wick. The light came alive in an instant, a steady flame blooming into brightness. It filled the room with warmth, casting long golden lines across the floorboards. The sea caught it, carried it, reflected it back. For a moment, she could see everything. The harbor, the inn, the faint trace of the path leading down toward the water. The world looked both small and endless, held together by this fragile circle of light. She turned the crank slowly, and the lantern began to move. Its beams swept across the horizon in deliberate rhythm, a pulse, a breath, a heartbeat of light. Elena stood there and watched it turn. Each rotation carried something away and brought something back. Time folded and unfolded with the motion, the past and present moving through each other like tide and shore. Below, a single wave broke against the rocks, white and brief in the darkness. The sound of it reached her a moment later, soft and certain. She whispered into the wind, "I remember." The flame flickered once, as if in answer. She stayed there until the stars thickened, until the light from the lantern felt less like a beacon and more like a companion, steady, unasking. Then she sat on the wooden floor, the journal open beside her, and let the turning light wash over her face. It was enough, she thought. Not closure, not forgiveness, just enough. The kind of enough that keeps you breathing. When she finally rose, she left the lantern burning. The sea below moved with its own quiet purpose, indifferent and eternal. From where she stood, the beam reached far into the dark, touching nothing, touching everything. Chapter 5, Section 5. The Morning Calm. The dawn came soft and without ceremony. No gulls cried, no wind moved. The light arrived as a slow unfurling, pale gold seeping across the horizon until it met the sea. Elena woke early, though she hadn't truly slept. The lantern had burned through the night. She had gone up twice to trim the wick, each time finding the world wrapped in the same deep, forgiving stillness. Now, standing at the window, she felt that stillness inside her. Not emptiness, not even peace, but something close to both. Outside, the tide was low. The rocks beneath the bluff shone wet and dark, breathing the faint mist that lifted off the water. A single fishing boat moved across the bay, its oars dipping in slow rhythm. The sound reached her late, muffled and pure. She made coffee the way she always did, measured, quiet, deliberate. Jonas wasn't back yet. The harbor would be keeping him another day or two. The inn was hers alone. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind in the beams. The fire had gone out, and she didn't relight it. The air was cool, but not unkind. When she stepped outside, the cold met her gently. The path down to the shore was slick with dew, the grass shining faintly in the early light. She carried her cup with both hands, breathing in the steam. The sea lay open before her, calm as sleep. The same sea that had taken Daniel, that had returned his words, that had carried Aaron away. But this morning, it felt different, not a presence to be reckoned with, but a simple fact of the world, like breath. It moved, it shimmered, it was. Elena sat on the low wall that edged the bluff. The stone was cool beneath her. She watched the water, the slow rise and fall of it. There was no urgency in her gaze now, no searching, only the small, steady act of looking. She thought of the journal upstairs, the page with Daniel's final words. She didn't need to read them again. They lived now in that quiet corner of her mind where grief and memory soften into one another. He had made it home, in the only way he could. And perhaps, at last, so had she. A light breeze rose from the west, brushing her hair across her cheek. She closed her eyes and let it pass. The air smelled faintly of salt and pine and something faintly sweet, the first wildflowers beginning to open along the dunes. When she opened her eyes again, the fishing boat had disappeared beyond the point. The sea was unbroken, whole. The world, for once, felt perfectly balanced. She stood, leaving her cup on the wall, and turned toward the inn. The lantern above still burned, its beam paling in the morning light. Soon she would snuff it, polish the glass, and let the day take over. But not yet. Not just yet. For now, she watched it glow faintly against the brightening sky, a fragile, persistent flame still holding its place between darkness and day. It would go out soon, but its warmth would linger, invisible and complete. Elena smiled, small, certain. Then she began to walk back up the path, the sound of her steps steady and sure. Behind her, the sea moved on in its endless way, carrying the morning forward. Epilogue, Lightkeeper. Years passed. The sea changed, as seas do. It took new names from new mouths. New storms swept across it. And still the tides came and went as though nothing had ever been lost. The lighthouse remained. Paint peeled from its sides, salt ate into the rails, and the brass of the great lamp grew dull between polishings. But the light endured. On clear nights, it could be seen far out on the water, its slow-turning rhythm marking the edge between safety and the unknown. Fishermen still set their watches by it. Children along the shore still counted the seconds between each sweep, making wishes before the beam came round again. One evening, many years after Elena's time, a young keeper named Maeve climbed the narrow stairs to trim the wick. She had only been at the post for a week, learning the patient language of the light. The logbook on the table was thick with names, each written in a different hand, the years layered like the tide lines on the rocks below. When she reached the top, she found a small leather journal resting on the windowsill, old, salt-stained, its spine softened by years of handling. The first page was blank, but inside, written in an uneven hand, were words that felt as though they had been waiting. The sea doesn't end. It only turns back on itself. Maeve traced the line with her finger. She didn't know who had written it, or why it had been left there. But she felt the truth of it, in the wind pressing against the glass, in the hum of the lamp, in the pulse of her own heart. She closed the book gently and looked out. Below, the town lay quiet beneath the rising mist. The light turned, slow and sure, sweeping across the open water. Somewhere beyond the curve of the horizon, the sea met itself again, the same wave beginning, ending, beginning. Maeve set the journal beside the lantern and let her hand rest on the rail. "Keep turning," she whispered. The light obeyed, steady as breath. And for a long time afterward, the beam could be seen reaching across the dark. Not searching, not calling, just shining.